and wait for more people. I don't know, 35. I think that we can start just now in time. First of all, let me say that as the president of the Italian Society for Law and Economics, I would like to welcome all of you to this conference. This is the 16th annual conference of the society, and it takes place in this strange way, but nevertheless, it is an important moment for our association. Of course, we have to give up a lot of the important aspects of this any conference, which are related to the possibility of having personal exchanges, um, which are important for critical discussion, mutual understanding, and also for reaffirming friendship relationship, which are very usually connected to our intellectual affinities, because many of us are devote so much time to research that typically our friendship are developed with people that share some point in our intellectual activities. So we have to let all this out this time, but nevertheless, organizing the conference was important for affirming the importance of mutual communication, especially in an interdisciplinary field as law and economics, and also to reaffirm our cooperative linkages and friendship relations. So this is in this aspect, the last word, friendship, is an additional reason for I am so happy to introduce to all of you the first plenary session speaker, Cristina Bicchieri, who is a professor of social thought and comparative ethics and professor of philosophy and psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. I don't know whether there are other professors in social thought and comparative ethics all over the world. Probably this is a specific definition that is tailored on Christina research activity. And she also the director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics in the University of Pennsylvania. Just to tell you something about his career, has been fellow of important research center all over the world: Cambridge, Harvard, Berlin, the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in Social Sciences, London School of Economics, and also in Jerusalem. And also he received the Pufendorf Medal in Sweden. Uh, as we many of us know, she is one of the most important scholar worldwide in the field of social norms. And also, she is not just an academician, or she is an academician that also consulted on this field, organizations with organizations like the UNICEF, World Banks, Gates Foundation, and the BBC. She is authors of more than 100 papers, and I think more now, but at least 7 books. Let
Yeah.
me remind it some titles: Rationality and Cooperation, The Logical Strategy, The Dynamics of Norm, Knowledge, Belief, and Strategic Interaction, and more recently, The Grammar of Society and Norms in the Wild. So so this is some aspect of her profile, but let me say that Christina, at least for me, according to my personal viewpoint, is mainly a great friend of mine. When she described herself, she said that her intellectual profile is along the border between philosophy, game theory, and psychology, as she had a primary research focus in judgment and decision about fairness, trust, and cooperation. Secondly, about the nature and evolution of social norms. And thirdly, an early research focus on the epistemic foundation of game theory. And I can add, yes, I remember hour and hour devoted with her spent in discussing this idea of how to find out epistemic foundation of game theory more than 30 years ago, and also more recently about experiments of social norms. So it's a friendship developed through intellectual affinity. I'm very happy for that. So I am happy to host you, Cristina, in this conference. And so the floor is your viewpoint about the nudging for on social norms.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the great introduction. And thank you so much for showing me several friends. And I'm very happy to do that, to do this work with you. Now, let me share at this point. Yes. And do you see the slides?
Yes.
Excellent. So this is the title, Not Nudging a Social Inference. And the interesting part of this talk, I will talk about some experiment, of course, but it's very interesting because all over Europe now, and even in Italy, there are groups linked, for example, in Rome. Il Comune di Roma has a behavioral group. There are behavioral groups all over. And of course, there are lots of behavioral groups in industry, in companies. Okay, now, what do they do? The idea is, how do we change behavior in a particular way? Now, everybody, I guess, has at least some knowledge of the Thaler and Sunstein 2008 book on nudging. And the idea is how to reframe, change, basically, the choice architecture to direct behavior in a more positive way. And the interesting thing of nudges is that they don't want to forbid any option. So they don't restrict the set of options, or they don't want to change economic incentives. So they don't work on punishment or premiums, etc. Now, the most common examples have been related to how to change, modify, and make better individual behavior. Okay, for example, I give you some example here. In Austria, they tried to nudge people to donate organ. Okay, and they do that creating a default. Basically, the default is that on death, you become a donor. If you don't want, of course, options are not restricted. You decide, you write down, no, I don't want to be a donor, and so on and so forth. Another great example has been in the US, the attempt of companies to induce people to save more in the pension plan, because these plans depend on the individual willingness to save. You can decide, I save nothing. And again, the default was a saving option, but then of course you can write, no, I don't want to save, etc. And another very successful one has been the famous Encourage trial that has been based on keeping people on taking medication. Think of diabetics or HIV positive people who have to take the medication constantly, and there are problems there. And so nudging has been very much related, initially at least, to these basically very individual and, as I will show, not interdependent behavior. Now, here we are. Now, nudges, however, and this is the most interesting application nowadays, work also through social comparison, okay? And what does it mean? It means that I tell the subjects that I want to reach. I tell the people what other people are doing or what other people are approving or disapproving of, okay? So it is information about other people. For example, Hallsworth in England, he was working for the UK government. He provided a nudge in which they alert taxpayers that the majority pay on time, and it had a positive effect, you know, a social comparison. Other people pay on time. The majority of other people actually pay on time. Maybe I should do the same. Okay. Driving feedback in Bogota is one of my favorites because I like very much the mayor, Bogota, Canas Mocus, and what he did. The driving in Bogota was horrible. There were a lot of dead people, accidents, and what he did, he got mimes going around the street with cards, green thumb up, red thumb down, and this was very observable. Remember, this observability sometimes is very important. And then what happened, they were giving good driver the green thumb up and the bad one the red thumb down. And again, everybody wanted a green thumb up. And so it was a sort of a nice nudge, and people were reacting in a very positive way. So social comparison did work. Now, what is the assumption which is necessary in this case to do this intervention? That the behavior you are targeting are interdependent. What does it mean? That my preference for doing the behavior is conditional on my expectation that other people do the behavior and or that other people approve of the behavior or disapprove of the contrary. So how do I define a norm nudge? So it's a nudge whose mechanism of action relies on eliciting, inducing social expectation with the goal of inducing desirable behavior under an assumption, which is crucial, that individual preferences for performing that behavior are conditional on social expectations. So if people's choice to behave one way or another is conditional on social expectation, what does it mean? That if we can change expectation, if we can induce different expectation, we can change behavior. Because you cannot change behavior if there is no conditional preference behind it, okay? And so which expectations are changed or induced in this norm nudging? There are two types of expectation. One is empirical. What, I want you to expect other people to do certain things. So I give you information on what they do, how they act in certain condition. And normative, I want to change what you expect other people approve or disapprove. So I tell you, I give you information about approval or disapproval. Okay. Now, there are certain requirements for norm nudging to be effective. Very important 3 points. Mechanism, motivation, context. Okay. First of all, you have to identify quite correctly the mechanism through which different type of information affect behavior. That is, if I give you empirical information, do I know how it affects behavior? Why it affects behavior in a certain way? If I give you normative information, do I know that it is effective? How do I know through which mechanism? This information is like a black box usually. And there is the input information and the output behavior. But the important thing is to open the black box and understand which mechanism are affected, okay? So that we get a nice output. Second, motivation. We have to understand the motivation for specific behavior. Think of littering. And the first question is, okay, we want to curb littering. Now, do people litter because it's convenient? Because there are only, trash cans very, very far away, in which case it's very easy, we put more trash cans. Or even if there are lots of trash cans, it is they see the environment is really dirty. So do I litter because it's convenient, or do I litter because other people litter? Well, you have to immediately ask yourself this question if you have to design an intervention. And third, but not least, we have to understand the context in which the behavior occurs. For example, we have noticed we went, and I suppose in Italy you're doing the same, from face-to-face lectures to internet lectures. Okay, we Zoom with the student, and we've noticed that certain behavior really have changed, and the kind of inducement that we could use in face-to-face can't be used in the internet Zoom context, for example. So mechanism, motivation, and context are three areas that we have to pay attention to. Now, when I say we have to understand what motivates behavior, okay, the main question is the behavior independent or interdependent? Because our intervention will be very different depending on the answer we give, okay? And in order to answer, we have to diagnose behavior, okay? And to diagnose behavior, we have to measure. And all my applied work is about measurement. And I have refined the measurement over the years. But basically what I measure are people expectation, social, the reference network, I'll show you why, and whether there are or not conditional preference, which is asking, are expectation causally relevant for behavior? This is very important, okay? So basically, what we have here is 4 types of behavior. To the right are all the interdependent behaviors. And when we measure, we put the behavior into these little squares. Interdependent behavior means that what other people do and what they approve of is absolutely relevant to your choice. So think of what I call descriptive norm. Descriptive norm are basically rules of behavior in which people prefer to follow the rule because they expect others to follow the rule. End of story. All conventions are like that. I stop at the red light exactly because I know other people will cross orthogonally to me, and they expect me to stop, and I expect them to cross. And on the other hand, when there is a red light for them, I go, very easily. People may say, oh, but there are laws. But apart from the laws, you want to really coordinate, and you have an expectation, a mutual expectation that allows you to coordinate. So your behavior is extremely interdependent, okay? And you have conditional preferences. But you can have conditional preferences also when you follow a fashion, okay? It is interdependent because I dress in a particular way, because I think when we were in high school, we did that, I think. We wanted to be, like the hot boys or girls at the time. And so we look at what they do, how they dress, and we want to imitate them. So a fashion or a fad is also a descriptive norm, and there is conditional preference. The most interesting case for us is the case of social norms. Social norms are rules of behavior in which we prefer to follow the rule because we have 2 expectations. One is empirical, because I think most other people are following the rule. But the second is also normative, because I expect most other people approve, think one should follow the rule. And why do we need the normative and empirical together in a social norm? Because social norms are there, and they wouldn't exist otherwise, to reconcile the tension that we often experience between what is personal welfare, what is good for me, in a sense, selfishly, and what is good for society. And social norms are there to reconcile the two. On the left side, we have independent behaviors. okay? For example, custom are like using an umbrella when it rains. You prefer to do that because you believe it meets your need and your need is not to get wet. Of course, you expect other people to do that, but this expectation has no causal influence on your choice to go out with an umbrella. Very important. Moral rules are independent too. I prefer not to harm innocent people because I believe is the right thing to do. It's really relevant for me whether other people do that, don't do that. Other people believe one should do, one shouldn't do. I don't care, okay? So custom and moral rules are great example of independent behavior, where I may have expectation, but they have no causal influence on my behavior, okay? This is very, very important to differentiate. Now, when we diagnose behavior via measurement, you know, there are two big set of behavior. To the left, there are behavior that we can direct and change, not the moral, but the custom for sure, with simple nudges. So using some sort of relying on people's psychology, basically, and psychological biases that we all have. To the right, instead, we have to use norm nudging. Why? Because in those cases, descriptive or social norm, expectation, social expectation, be they empirical or both empirical and normative, play a crucial role in moving people to choose or not choose something. So it's very important when you want to do nudging, norm nudging, you are in this right side of the diagram. Now, norm nudging has been typically done, it's very often done, and typically done using empirical information. Okay, so which is we give people information about what other people do. Now, what are the other people? I mentioned the word reference network. What does it mean? It means that the people I give you information about must be people that you care about, that are relevant to your choice, okay? So when you drive, the other driver, the people who walk on the street, those who bicycle, the motorcycle, so all these people or machines, in a sense, buses, whatever you may encounter in your driving are part of your reference network, okay? In a study I did on use of toilet in India, you have to be careful about the reference network because my initial assumption was, well, the reference network are the neighbors. Wrong. The reference network are family and close friends. And if they are your neighbor, great. But if they are not, you don't care about the neighbor, you care about these other people. And so we normally measure reference network because norms are properties of networks, not of people, okay? Remember that. So the idea here is giving information about what others do. And it's very important that you choose the right reference network. Let's look at some example of success. This success is related to electricity and water use. So for example, Alcott did a study comparing electricity consumption to what the neighbors consume. And overall, consumption was reduced, which is very good. The last message, hotel guest, you know, you very often when you go in a hotel, you see a little card that say, please reuse your towels, you know, so we save water, etc. And there was this experiment in which they were telling guests that most other guests reuse towel. I will come to this experiment later because there is interesting variation. And overall, most guests have reused towels. And another water consumption in California, Sion Bannock did this experiment in which he paired information about the water consumption of the neighbors with a little drop, and the drop of water, and the drop is happy, unhappy, or neutral. So there is a normative message also included in that, and consumption was reduced. So they were, you know, nice intervention. However, some intervention, very similar, may not work at all. And Schultz has a wonderful example. So comparing electricity consumption to neighbors, but what they did, they say, what is the average consumption of neighbors? Average. What happened? People below average went to the average, consumed more, and people who were above went a little bit down. And so basically there was no overall change. And this is very interesting, why this happens, okay? So there are failures with sending empirical information, and we have to be very careful about why it fails. So first of all, failure can be due to the misunderstanding from our part, not people part, on what is the reference network, who are these people you are comparing me with, okay? A very good example of a good job was Hallsworth, that, you know, in the UK, they realized that in certain areas, particularly was in London, GP, general practitioners, many of them were overprescribing antibiotics. And you know, it's better not overprescribe antibiotics for many reasons. And so what they did, they informed the overprescribing doctor that they prescribed more than 80% than other doctor in their area. I underline that. And this reduced antibiotic prescription. If they had done London versus Scotland, the London doctor may have said, hey, in Scotland, you know, there is much less pollution, so they don't get all these diseases that we see here. And so it's right to prescribe more antibiotics here in London. So it's very important, you know, that the reference network is clearly defined and rightly defined. And as I said before, specifying being right about the reference network helps avoid self-serving, self-justifying interpretation, okay? I go back to the hotel guest story because it's very interesting. So they did 3 different experiments. In one, you receive a message about hotel guests in general in the US. Do that. In the second is hotel guests in your hotel. And in the third, which my students find creepy, is hotel guest in your room, room 325, let's say. And they see a huge effect for hotel guests in your room because it's a very strong reference network for some reason. And hotel guests in this hotel is less, and hotel guests in general, no. Simply because people may think, okay, this is a nice hotel. They are telling me hotel guests all over the US. You know, there are lots of cheap hotels. Of course, in cheap hotels, people behave like that. And so they completely disregard this type of message and information. Okay. One other reason why empirical messages may not work is that the message is not be trusted or credible. And the messenger may not be trusted or credible. And we have a very nice experiment. I cannot talk about it today, but about COVID-19 and, you know, norm nudging and trust in science. And what we show is that even if norm nudging is very successful and people will have very high expectation about compliance with the rules that the government, you know, has passed, if there is no trust in science, there will be very little compliance. So this has to be kept in mind. And also people tend to reject information that is inconsistent with their beliefs. That's what we do constantly. Now, what about giving normative messages? And there is a lot of confusion about the effectiveness of these messages, okay? Some normative messages about water conservation were effective, okay? Cialdini with littering claims the positive normative outweighed the negative descriptive, but myself in an old experiment with the Xiao, we show exactly the opposite. Then where there is incongruence between the empirical and the normative, people follow the empirical. This is very important, okay? Also, COVID-19 example, we have received lots of messages, some strong normative, but then they accompanied by the description. Let's say we see in television in Florida, thousands of kids were populating the beaches without masks, being very close to each other. So we get very, very conflicting messages. And very often we know experimentally that when there are these conflicting messages and self-serving behavior is not wearing a mask, going to the bar, staying with friends, then people will do that, okay? And last but not least, a pure normative message, do the right thing. This is the right thing to do, may give people, a wrong type of information. Because if you need to tell me what the right thing to do is, it means that people don't do the right thing. And so what I infer from the message is not exactly what the message aimed to do, okay? Now, norm nudging so can have complication, but it can entirely backfire. We have to be worried about that. So information, when it allows self-serving interpretation, it allows for what Jason Dana called the moral wiggle room. Okay, what does it mean? That like the doctor in Scotland and the doctor in London, they say, okay, I am in London, I overprescribe, but you are telling me maybe that in Scotland they don't do that. I don't care because I am in London. So there is a self-serving assessment that is possible. Also, and this is very important because we see it done very often in corruption campaigns. We mention, or the government mention, that many people engage in corruption, in socially harmful behavior. What is the fact? It normalizes it. This is very important to keep in mind. To divulge, to make very clear to people the high frequency of negative behavior normalizes it, okay? Now, what happens when you tell people that many people misbehave? And here, and this is a topic I am experimenting on, we draw asymmetric inferences from different types of information. So when the negative behavior is presented as very common, so it's an empirical information, we immediately infer that it is approved by the people who do it. So we infer the normative from the empirical, okay? And this is very bad. Also, on the other side, when we tell people, but many people disapprove of this negative behavior, people don't infer that they don't do it. So the inference from disapproval to not doing is very weak, though the inference from doing to approving is very strong. So there is an asymmetry in these inferences, and we prove it experimentally, okay? Third, but not the last point, when there is conflict between empirical and normative information, this is the old experiment I did with Xiao in 2009, will lead to the empirical information being much more powerful than the normative. Very important to keep in mind. Now, let me talk about some recent experiments we did. We still have some time. And we were very interested in asking whether individual, if there is moral wiggle room, basically, if individuals tend to choose self-serving beliefs more often when they are faced with empirical versus normative information. And what we did, we provided information about an uncertain state of the world and check if there is belief distortion, okay? And the hypothesis is there will be belief distortion, but it will be facilitated by the asymmetry between normative and empirical information. Well, let's see. The design is a die under the cap experiment. You know, it's a well-known experiment in which basically in complete anonymity, is double blind, not even the experimenter knows what you're doing, they will know the result. You toss a die, if the number 5 come out, you get the prize, you get some money. If any other number come out, you get nothing. And there is a lot of scope for cheating because you can only say, I got a 5, okay? And we don't know, we have to pay you. Okay. Now, before we explain the experiment and we say this experiment has been done with lots of other people. And we give you, some statements about, and I show you the statements about what other people in that experiment have done or believed should be done, okay? And half of the participants will know that after this elicitation of belief, which I show you in a moment, they will play the game. Half don't know that they will play the game. They think this is the end, okay? Okay, so what do I show? Half of the people have this normative condition, half have the empirical. So suppose you are one of my subjects and you are in the normative uncertainty condition, and I tell you, okay, I have done this experiment with other people, and please read these 2 statements and tell me which one is true. And if your guess is correct, I pay you. And so the one is, in a similar study, most people said it is acceptable to lie for your own benefit. And, or, you know, another possibility is, in a similar study, most people said it is not acceptable to lie for your own benefit. So you decide which one is true. There is one which is true. That's what people effectively said. And if you guess correctly, you get a prize. The other group is empirical uncertainty condition. Please, we have done this experiment, so we know what happened. And if you guess correctly and choose the right statement, you get a prize. In a similar study, most people lied for their own benefit, or in a similar study, most people did not lie. Please choose, okay? So half are shown the normative, half the empirical. Of those, half that choose the normative, half know that they will play the game, and so there will be a possibility to cheat afterwards, half don't. Same story with empirical, okay? And now, just look at this table. The first, horizontal, the 2 first top horizontal one are the belief elicitation. And how many choose that say that the right empirical statement is yes, the majority lied. And look, almost 63% of those who knew they would play the game afterward say, oh yes, the majority lied. Only 47% of those who didn't know that they would play the game claimed that the majority lied. So it looks if there is some sort of belief manipulation with empirical beliefs, because those that know they will play the game, know they will be able to cheat, choose as true the statement, yeah, the majority lied, so that they tend to justify probably their own later lying. If you look at the belief, the normative belief, the majority approves of lying, the results are the same. So even if you want to cheat, you don't want to say that the majority approve of lying. You think it's not true. It doesn't matter that the majority approve of lying or not. And just forget, that there is, of course, a correspondence in the behavior. But the interesting thing is the manipulation of beliefs, okay? In the case when you receive empirical information, those who know they will be able to cheat afterwards really manipulate their empirical expectation, while the normative expectation stays the same. So we're very curious why there is this difference. So we did a follow-up survey with two variations. In one group, we give them empirical information and elicit their normative expectation. And in the other group, we do the opposite. We give normative information and elicit empirical expectation. So in the first group, we say the majority of participants did not lie for their own benefit. How many disapproved of lying? The second group, the majority of participants disapprove of lying. How many did not lie for their own benefit? Look at the result. Okay, so on the left, we tell them the majority did not lie. Please tell us, how many disapprove of lying? Well, a large majority disapprove of lying. This is the answer. So if they don't lie, it must be true that they disapprove of lying. So from the empirical information, they infer the normative very clearly, very well. Look at the right side. Now I give you only the normative information. The majority disapprove of lying. Now, how many do you think really lied? Well, 50-50, okay? So there is an asymmetry in inference from empirical to normative and normative to empirical. And this is very important. So we have to pay attention to the information we give. Very important. Okay, so after this result, I, with a student of mine, decided to do an experiment on norm inferences. So on the reasoning process in which we derive the information about the social group from a very summary representation of behavior, their behavior, empirical information, or their belief, normative information. And what we show is very interesting. That first of all, that there are differences in norm inference across behavioral domains. Second, that inferences vary by the type of expectation being elicited, whether it's normative or empirical. And third, this is very important, that this effect is modulated by the valence of the depicted behavior, by whether the behavior is negative, like bribing, or positive, like donating to a charity. So participants, we randomly assign them to judge the approval rates of a behavior among residents in a totally hypothetical city after they receive empirical information regarding how common the behavior is. Or alternative, they have to judge the prevalence of a behavior after receiving information about how endorsed, how approved the behavior is, okay? And so we use a 2x2 factorial design and randomize for each person the order of 23 different behavior, 23 different behavior. And for each behavior, you, my subject, were randomly assigned to one of four conditions: empirical positive, empirical normative positive, empirical negative, normative negative. I show you what happens. So here, 4 different participants, each of them is in one of these conditions. So let's say speed driving, okay? And we have many of these conditions. But in this particular, with speed driving, either you receive the empirical positive. In this new city, most residents drive below the speed limit. Now tell us how many residents you think say it's appropriate to drive below the speed limit. And you have a slider that go from 0% to 100%. And you tell us, you know, what's the frequency of appropriateness. The normative positive is in this new city, most residents say it is appropriate to drive. Tell us how many residents do indeed drive below the speed limit. And then we have the negative condition. In this new city, more residents drive above the speed limit. How many do you think approve of that? In this new city, most residents approve of driving above. How many people really do that? Okay. Now, these are the results, are very, very interesting. Look at the left side. So we have in the horizontal axis, we have two different conditions. When the norm is positive, for example, they drive below the speed limit. And when the norm is negative, they drive above the speed limit. Now, in both cases, positive and negative, the inference rating is always higher. And this is higher, not just with the speed limit, but across all the domains that we have analyzed, okay? So higher rating in positive versus negative condition across all the behavior we have analyzed, okay? There is another interesting element. You see this is a box plot. So it's let's look at the empirical information. Here, there is a huge variance, and for normative too, there is much more variance in the inference rating when people are given negative information. When they are given positive information, their inference rating, you know, there is less variability, basically. But this is the most important diagram, okay? Now, again, here we have positive, and here we have negative. The blue is empirical information. The red is normative information. And look what happens. In a positive norm condition, giving people empirical information, their estimate, okay, the estimate norm inference, okay, is much higher than if we give, than if we give the normative information. Is what I said before. If I tell you that most people drive below the speed limit, okay, you will estimate that a large percentage of these people, most people, approve of that. Instead, if I tell most people approve of driving below the speed limit, you don't infer that such large number also do that. So there is an almost 8% higher estimate with the empirical versus the normative information in the positive condition. The opposite happens in the negative condition. So if I tell you, for example, that, let's look at this, that most people approve of bribing, you will infer that, you know, quite a few people will bribe. If I tell you that most people, you know, bribe, okay, I will not infer, okay, the inference rating from the empirical information of the negative. I won't infer that indeed most people approve of bribing. So there is an asymmetry between empirical and normative inference, both in the positive and in the negative information and norm behavior. So many behavior follow the pattern. Cutting in line is one, tax evasion is another, littering in the street is another. So there is this double asymmetry, perfect. Cheating in exams is another. So most behaviors follow this pattern. However, there are outliers. And one interesting there are two interesting outliers here. The bribing, what was the bribing? The bribing was, you know, that in the US there's been a scandal about bribing admission officers in university to get your child in. And these bribes were quite consistent, sometimes $500,000. So it was very high. And here you don't see this asymmetry. And also with the vaccine is another interesting story, because you see an asymmetry in the positive, but not in the negative. Why so? And we show, actually, we analyze all these cases, and we find that the pattern of norm inference is context dependent. Okay, and some behavior, like the bribing public officer of the vaccine, falls out, okay, of the asymmetry pattern that I discussed before. And what we find is that we can explain the outliers by how observable the behavior is, by how frequent the behavior is, and how much, the vaccine is an example, how much there is agreement among the responders about, you know, for example, vaccination. There are a lot of Novax people, and so people know that. And let's look at the bribing case, which is interesting. So when I give my subject the belief, okay, I say this is a common belief in this vignette, that it is permissible, that people approve of bribing college officer to get your child into college, they don't infer that then this behavior is common. Why? Because the commonness in this case is conditional on the proportion, on the frequency of how many people are able to pay so much. Very few, okay? So even if I tell you in this particular experiment that in this ideal place, in this fake place, if you will, most people think it is okay to bribe public officer, you will not infer that it is a frequent behavior. Why? Because you think that very few people can afford it. And so you don't have this usual inference from doing the bad thing, you know, from approving, sorry, the bad thing, you are going to do that. This is very important. So we found a double asymmetry in norm inference. Okay, on the one hand, when we give empirical information about a behavior that is positive, people will also have a parallel normative inference. It is accepted. It's positive. Most people do it. It means they like it. They want to do it. They think it is appropriate. Okay. When we give normative information about bad behavior, people approve of bribing. Okay. What is the empirical inference? Then they do it. If they approve, they must do it. Okay. So this type of inference support our mental association of what is common with what is acceptable. And this has been shown in many, many experiments. People assume that what is a common, what they perceive as common, is acceptable. Okay, and what is acceptable, you know, is permissible. You can do it. Okay. Also, our findings suggest that the direction and relative strength of the association, okay, could be modulated by the valence of the behavior, whether it's positive or negative. So if the behavior is positive, you follow common is acceptable heuristic when you make inference. But when the behavior is negative, the strength of the association between common and acceptable is completely reversed, and individuals infer other behavior to a greater prevalence from the normative attitude. So there is a total asymmetry between the empirical and the normative message in the inference you draw, and also this asymmetry is modulated by the positive versus negative behavior. This is crucial to keep in mind when you do norm nudging, because what sort of message are you sending? You know, you must have in mind, you must have some idea of what people infer or do not infer from it. I don't think I have that much time left, so I may stop here. And, you know, I have other experimental results if you want to discuss them maybe later in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting and a lot of the points to be asked, I think. We have half an hour, more or less, for discussion. And I would like to ask everybody to, if they have to ask a question in order to create an order to tell it in the chat, so I can create an order in which I will give the possibility to ask questions or to make comments. So, and anybody has any? I don't see at the moment questions in the chat. It's also just necessary to tell I want to ask. Okay. Yeah. Laura Marcon may ask. We have to make short questions and comments, of course, because we have to give time for as much comments as possible. Please, Laura.
Okay, thank you so much for the very interesting talk. And I have maybe just two more theoretical questions rather than experimental question. The first one is how do you consider the role of personal normative beliefs? That is quite a central concept in your last book, like related to this asymmetry in inference between like normative and empirical inference. So this would be the first question. And the second one is, how do you see, or do you consider the relationship between joint commitment? Like, I mean, with commitment, I understand the sort of source of motivational mechanism in order to change collective behavior. So what would be the relationship between commitment and expectation? We should manipulate expectations first in order to get a sort of joint commitment, or joint commitment between parties would be the first step in changing bad social norms and so in change bad social expectations. So this would be my two questions. Thanks.
Very good. Let's start with the first, the personal normative beliefs question, you know, how they affect these inferences. Well, of course, the crucial thing is to understand if we are dealing with an independent or interdependent situation. You know, there are people think of, and you see that in the vignette actually, because I do the vignette with thousands of people, not with 3 people. So, for example, suppose that the vignette about bribing a public officer, you know, I present people with this vignette. And suppose there is a person who thinks it is never acceptable, etc. But the question is, even if I think it is never acceptable, myself, if you show me a situation in which most of these people think it is acceptable, what do I infer? I infer that they do. So remember that in the vignette, and this is a discussion we should have about vignette, why we do vignette. We do vignette because we want to present people with hypothetical situations, avoiding projection of their own beliefs. So I tell you, there are this mass of people that do these things. What do you think they believe? Or there is this mass of people that believe that. What do you think they do? And so it should not enter, okay? Your personal beliefs should not enter in your assessment, given that I give you this information. Okay, this is very important. Okay, very, very important. In other type of vignette, instead, they may play a role, but not so much here. Now, the joint commitment. Okay. Now, what do you mean by joint commitment? Okay, there is really a conscious joint commitment. So you are committed to do certain things with other people. My question to you.
Yes, I mean, like a sort of, you know, mechanism, a motivational mechanism.
Absolutely.
So a sort of mechanism to change bad social pattern of behavior.
Absolutely. This is a little different story here, because we know that to change norm, to change a bad norm, you know, you need some sort of commitment on the part of the people, you know, to behave differently. Okay, and this commitment may include some sanction, negative sanction for those that misbehave, for example. So there is a dynamics of norm change in which joint commitment plays a very important role. Yeah, we see that. You saw the study I did in India and with living open defecation is exactly very often in the village people enter joint commitments, etc. So it's very, very important. And it is a source of motivation. It is a source of motivation. Now, in this case, in my study, it's very different because there is no joint commitment whatsoever. And it is a vignette in which I ask about an hypothetical situation with completely different people. And I tell you, well, if these people have this belief, right or wrong, I don't care. You know, I don't care how you judge this belief. They do have, it's a fact, they have this belief. What do you infer about their behavior? Or they behave, what do you infer about their belief? It's completely different. You know, I want to study the mechanism of social inference. Okay.
Yeah, sort of meta perspective, like a sort of
absolutely. And your question, about joint commitment, I completely agree. Yes, it is a very powerful source of motivation. Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. But my problem was like the relationship.
No, Laura, stop. We can continue in this dialogue because there are other people who want to ask something.
Yeah.
Thank you for your questions. But let me. There are two. I would put together two questions so you may have a joint answer or not, or do you prefer that we go on with the individual questions?
As you prefer. I mean, it's
I give
anything is fine.
So Andy Finette could ask a first question, and then Lorenzo Passerini a second, and so you may give a joint answer. So it's a way for having more people.
Okay.
May ask something. So Andy, you hear me? Where are you?
I'm here.
Ask your questions.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a different interpretation of your results. I believe that empirical information, so norm nudging, the empirical sense, creates social comparison, whereas normative information creates something which makes people interact in a coordination game. You see, then on one hand you have social preferences which are involved, and on the other hand it is a matter of equilibrium selection. This is my interpretation for why you have different, well, the empirical results that you've shown can be explained along those lines. That is when you think about normativity. Normativity means reasons to do something. So when you give a normative information, so you have reasons to do a specific thing which is prescribed by, you know, the description of by the information, you know, the norm itself. This would be why whatever happens, whatever the information is, the fact that it is normative, it leads people to coordinate on this particular action. Whereas in the descriptive information, then you have those valence which plays because people are engaging to social comparison, and it matters according to their social preferences. That is my interpretation. So I don't know what you think about it.
Okay.
I would like to ask Lorenzo Passerini to ask a second question.
Okay,
so
and I answer everything. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, my question is, do you ever heard about, did you ever heard about the non-hero argument? The non-hero argument, I heard it this morning on the radio by a speaker on the radio who was talking about donations. And his argument was like that. You have to donate. This is a norm, but this norm is only for heroes. Me, I'm an ordinary people, so I stick to what most ordinary people do. So this may be a possible argument as a justification in one's mind, even for corruption, for instance. I know that I can keep alive a norm, contrary to what Niklas Luhmann says, that in case of frequent dissonance between a normative expectation, the norm fades away. The norm may still be alive because people may use this kind of argument. I'm not a hero, so I will stick to what most people do, which is not complying with the norm. But I don't think that the norm is not a right norm, but it is right only for heroes or saints or something like that. Thank you. It was just this.
Two very, very good questions. So let me start from Andy. So empirical expectations create social comparison. Well, certainly when you want to create social comparison, you give empirical information. Okay, so it's not that empirical expectations per se create social comparison. It is the opposite. When you want to have social comparison, you give them people, you know, information that will create expectation about what other people do. So it's reversed. With normative expectation and equilibrium selection, so normative expectations, basically, again, I tell you what people approve or disapprove of. Okay. Now, there is a technique now very criticized by Krupke-Weber they say, oh, we find norms. And how do they find norms? They ask people about, they make them play basically a coordination game in which, you know, I give you a prize if you tell me what a randomly chosen player approve, whether a randomly chosen player approve or disapprove of a certain behavior. And if you have a very similar answer, then you say, okay, it means that people are coordinating on that behavior. Is not, you know, Lorenzo has a very nice paper against it. And I agree. Now, when you want to unearth a social norm, and here you have to come with me with my definition, which you may disagree with, the social norm has both components, an empirical and a normative component. Why? Because a social norm very often, most of the time, exists to recompose the individual and the collective interest. Okay, if you just tell me most people do X, fine, most people do X. Why should I do it? unless it is in my interest, like in a convention, to imitate, to do exactly what other people do because I want to coordinate with them, you know, fine, they do that, I don't care, okay? If you tell me just the normative, most people approve of that, great, good for them. But should I do it? You know, I'm not sure that then people do it if they approve. So it's not obvious that I should immediately, you know, act in that way. It is only the combination of the two that forms an inducement, provided I have some conditional preference, you know, to do that. So in this sense, is the social norm to the complexity, the social norm that leads to an equilibrium selection, not the normative alone, nor the empirical alone. It's both they lead to equilibrium selection. When I talk of social norm, I exactly talk of a rule of behavior, a behavior which is supported by conditional preference, etc., etc. Now in game theory, and I'm writing a theoretical paper about that as we speak, in game theory, normative expectations do not exist. We have empirical expectation. And second order, third order, think of rationalizability of empirical expectation. The problem is normative expectations are not part of the description. And so we have to modify a little bit game theory to introduce normative expectation and deal with social norm equilibrium. This is my answer. Normativity. Normativity say the reason for doing something. Normativity is the reason for. Well, it depends, because you know, there can be reasons for doing something, like when we imitate the behavior of other people, you know, we have a reason for doing that. Because, for example, when I want to buy a refrigerator, I go on Amazon and I look at what people say that bought that refrigerator about that product, okay? And so I will use this information, you know, to buy or not to buy or completely discard this type of refrigerator. So this gives me a reason for buying it, which is normative in a very weak sense. And I think, you know, that Andy, you had a very strong sense of normativity. So normativity can be understood in many different ways, okay? And reason for doing something can be sort of elevated reasons, but also very low-level reasons, okay? Going to the hero, non-hero argument, I love that. That's a very interesting example. So, you know, I am told that, you know, I think it may be a reference network issue here. I may be wrong, but, you know, just on the spot, answering you on the spot. Because if you tell me, okay, you know, people, is a good thing to donate to charities, okay? It's the right thing to donate to charity. Charity need our money to do good things. And you're not giving me a norm. You're giving me some normative information. People think is a good thing to do, okay? Now, I may think, yeah, people may think it's good to do, but do they give, they don't give? You know, who knows? It's 50-50 probably. And so then I decide on my own what to do. The norm is for heroes. Again, think of my definition of social norm, okay? It has to combine the empirical and the normative information, okay? And the empirical is not just the heroes, is most people, I have information that most people give to charities. That makes it a social norm, okay? Otherwise, you're telling me, you're giving me an injunctive story, okay? Either you tell me people think that one should do that, and then I show with my study of social inference that most people don't believe that they all follow through, one point. Or if it is a social norm, there must be an empirical component. I must believe that people are following it. So I don't think that it is a good argument. Again, the norm is for heroes is an argument about receiving normative information, but not inferring that people do that. And so you may think, oh, those who do that are only, you know, the more, the best people, the Mother Teresa of the world. I am not Mother Teresa, so I don't do that. But this, in effect, not just of knowing that there is a norm, because then if you know there is a norm, you have empirical expectation too. But receiving normative information. And then what do I infer? You're right. I may infer, hi, you know, most people are not saints. So yes, they think so, but they won't follow through. So I won't follow through either.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Maybe just in designing nudges, maybe it's important.
Who's talking?
We cannot make.
No, sorry.
Lorenzo, questo era Lorenzo. Sì.
Yeah, I have to. Simone De Colle, have to ask a question, which is that I agree with. It's very interesting. So please, Simone. And then I will join him because no, you have to open your microphone, Simone.
Simone.
Hi, yes.
Okay, ask the question, please.
I just comply with your norms, and so I wrote the question. So do you want me to read it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I was very interested. Thank you so much for your talk, Cristina. And if I think about your taxonomy of the 4 types of behavior, now you make me understand better, of course, reminding me what your definition of social norm is. But it seems to me that in the table, to see moral rule, the definition you give a moral rule there seems to be just talking about one way of thinking of moral rules, which is basically deontology. I do it because I think it's the right thing to do. And this in your taxonomy is the box where you say it's independent from what others do. But if I think of other normative ethical theories, like both virtue ethics and utilitarianism, I would say, in those way of formulating what is the right thing to do, what others people do actually does matter. Because, for example, for Aristotle, the golden mean is what we know observing other people's behavior. And from Mill, we know that, you know, there are the external sanction, that it's kind of all peer pressure to do something. So what other, it's not independent of. So I was wondering whether it's about, yeah, you know, redefining moral rule there, or it creates a sort of dichotomy, which I don't see. Because when you say in social norm, you have both the empirical and normative, I think also in some moral rules, you have both empirical and normative. So I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. It's clear. Can I add myself to this question? Because I have exactly the same question on a point, which is connected on more general question. On the specific point that the square in which you define morality as independent behavior, it's clear. I agree with Simone, not so much with the example that he makes, but more general. Consider contractarianism, which is a way for making justification of behavior. This is based on the idea that other people agreed or can agree under some condition of impartiality. So it's not about what the other people is going to do tomorrow, but what the people would agree under some condition, but it is not independent on their behavior and not independent on an expectation about others. And moreover, when we talk about the psychology of justice, you know that we worked on the idea of the sense of justice by your roles, and it is based on the mutual expectation about behavior of others. So there are 2 conditions. First, principles are justified in the term of a general agreement. Second, I expect. So you cannot say that contractarian ethics is not morality. So there are kind of ethical theories in which there is a double dependence on others. First, there is a general agreement from an ideal point of view. Second, the sense of justice is activated because of public knowledge or public expectations about others. And this opened my second question, that it's clear that you make a strong point about the explanation of social norms in terms of two components, the normative one and the positive or descriptive one. Very clear, and it seemed to me very important. And my point is whether the main way for making sense of the normative is normative expectations. Because, of course, here you have to create a reason to act, a kind of reason to act. And so my point is normative expectation the main way in which we can create normative reasons to act? Maybe sometimes it is, but it is not so in general. For example, it could be that the normative reason on one side is given by, for example, that there is a model of general acceptance based on an agreement that we think there is or there could be or that should be. And on the other side, we have a positive expectation. This is not so much against what normally is going on to do in our interaction. So there are normative reasons on one side and positive reasons based on descriptive beliefs. On the other side, you have to work with these two hands, but it is not clear to me that the normative part is based on normative expectation. In fact, this is exactly what you find in your research. That is, that when you give normative expectations to them, and you see that they don't drive or don't infer from them that people normally will do this. There is not that strong inference between, or better, the positive the expectation is stronger than the normative one. But the point is, according to me, is that the fact that I know that somebody thinks that it is appropriate to do something is not a normative reason to do something. Why should I do something just because other thinks that we should do something? It's not strong. I must accept, I must share the normative reason for some reason. While at the same time, when you know that most of people do something which is according to some obvious rule of behavior, we think that this reminds us that there is a moral reason to do that problem. But it's clear that having an expectation about what other people think should be done, not strong moral or normative reason to do something. It must be reflected in some normative reason that you already have. This is my point, but so it's about the classification and also about this, whether we really should think that normative arguments enter in this form of normative expectation.
Okay, a lot of it is a very complex issue here. I am on the verge of writing an article actually about moral versus social norms. I'm thinking about these things a lot. Let's talk about, Simone, that talks about, let's say, utilitarianism. Well, it is a fact that with utilitarianism, for example, the crucial question would be, is it a good rule? Okay, the main question is not so much, how many people would do it, etc. In moral rules, one thing that we should ask is it a good rule? What sort of principles it fulfills? Now, for Kant, is very different than from a traditional utilitarian. Okay, the utilitarian is super consequentialist, so it increases, the public welfare, let's say, whatever, however it is conceived. And for Kant, instead, it is universalizable and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is a question we philosophers ask about moral rules, okay? Not so much about moral behavior, which is a very different thing, okay? Moral rules are rules that we may embrace, that of which we judge the goodness, the relevance, etc., etc. Now, then another question, and this is a question that I do not ask, okay? That I ask in my private life, of course, but I don't ask in the kind of study I do. What is a good rule? Now, the question I ask is, why do I follow a moral rule versus, something else? And here I look very carefully at what I call conditional preferences. Is my preference for following the moral rule conditional on expecting other people to follow and approve of it or not? Okay, and even a utilitarian, okay, that believes in neuro-utilitarianism would keep saying this particular rule is extremely good, okay, but I may not follow it because, okay, I see that nobody's following it, so it would be, useless, to follow it, for example. This is not a conclusion that the normal old utilitarians, draw, actually, but it is, I think, very important to differentiate between the assessment of the rule. Is it a good rule? What is good about it, etc. And saying it is a good rule, it might give me a reason to follow it because it's a good rule. Okay, so I may have a reason to follow it. And my question is this reason dependent on the fact that other people follow the rule or not? Is it dependent on the fact that other people approve of the rule, that there is a huge approval of this rule, a huge agreement on the rule or not? This is my question. It's a very specific question about social conditionality. And my great division, if you will, that is not a division about, what is a good rule, not a good rule, what reason people may have to follow what they believe is a good rule, etc., etc. But my question is very specific. Are my preference for choosing the rule conditional or not? And I believe that when we deal with moral rules, and believe me, there are very few that deserve to be called moral, mostly are social, and we may moralize them, we may internalize them, but they still remain social. Moral rules, again, there are very few, I believe, and I believe strongly that we do not follow them conditionally on social expectations. We may follow them conditionally on believing they are the right rule, on believing they benefit the greatest number of people, etc., etc. But it's a different type of conditionality. Okay, this is what I believe. About contractarianism, again, is an ideal configuration of institutions. That's what Rawls' idea was. So at the beginning, Rawls had a sort of decision theoretic. We know, Lorenzo, we discussed that in the past many times, has an idea, a sort of decision theoretic ideas that, of course, economists criticize to no end, especially Kenneth Arrow, but even Harsanyi, okay? And then he moved to Kant, okay? Because as if, you know, this Kantian foundation could not be criticized, basically. It was a big step. And again, you know, in contractarianism, you can have exactly fundamental reasons to embrace a contractarian model, okay? But then my question is, once you have, you know, to choose a particular target behavior, is your choice independent of what other people do or approve or do and approve, or is it dependent? This is my discriminating point. Okay, then the reason, I may have tons, you know, normally, listen, we have many reasons to do a certain action, many, not one, okay? But the important thing when you do experiment, you want to tease out these reasons and think, what is the main causal effect here? That's what we do.
So you would say that
yes,
compliance is a social norm, while the ex-ante acceptance or contractarian is moral. It's moral because it's an ideal model of choice, while compliance, de facto compliance, needs a social norms based on conditionality. Because also this would say, could be said by contractarians like David Gautier, for example. It's, this expectation is relevant in the compliance domain. It is always the compliance with the moral norms. Compliance with the moral norm usually entails social norms that explain why you de facto comply. So this is dependent. Could be something like that.
I don't agree completely with your interpretation of Gautier. Yes, he has an idea of coordination, basically, that you coordinate on that, etc. I don't think he has really an idea of social norm. It's more a descriptive norm element, but this would be too long a conversation. But I agree with you. We have a lot of independent reasons and dependent reasons. The problem is when you want to do interventions and you have to decide, you know, where basically where to act. Okay, it's very applied. All this stuff in my mind came to my mind when I had to do applications, because at that point I really needed to know and know pretty well and pretty clearly whether choices are conditional on something and conditional on what. Okay, because if I can say they are, then I will act in this particular case on expectations. If they are not, first of all, if they are not, on the one hand, it's very easy to change customs because you introduce new ways to satisfy those means and convince people to use them. But to change the moral is very difficult. It's very, very difficult. If people really have a moral conviction about what is right, what is good, it's very hard to change it. And we saw that because there are certain behavior that are conceived by people as moral, it's very hard to change them. Whenever you have a social norm, it's much easier, hard still, but easier. If it is a moral conviction, it's very hard.
There is a last question by Giovanni Tuzet, and I can ask him to ask by himself briefly.
No need to ask the question. Well, just a comment. I mean, I don't need to ask.
Okay.
It's a very interesting question, actually, about common law.
Yeah.
Where you take, I'm thinking of the English system, where you take precedent as super important. And again, is precedents create expectations? Yeah. You know, I never thought of that. So it's really a new line of thought, but it looks as if it is a social norm, because it has a huge empirical content. There is all the precedent, what people have done, and what we may expect people to keep doing, I guess, okay? And the normative is, the normative seems, now I don't know common law, you know, the really basic thing, and is very much inductive, not deductive, like, let's say, Roman law. But the interesting thing is there normative depending on the empirical? This is a question for you from me. Does the normative sort of emerges out of the empirical?
As to binding precedent, I would say no. I would say yes as to customary law, what we in Italian we call consuetudine, which is exactly something very, very similar to social norms. As to precedents in the common law system, I'm not sure, because there are, from the start, there is the idea that some things are binding. So they do not really depend on the empirical condition, while customary law seems to be the case. Yeah.
Thank you. It's very interesting. It looks like social norms completely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's very good.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the time is over, even if there is not so much delay. So if there is another question, we can give room for doing it, or because the plan was to finish at 7:00 p.m. in Italy. So maybe you're done, and I can thank you very much, Cristina. We have to discuss more in depth the point, because
Yeah, I think so.
my answer would say that if you want to make a policy, you have to give a normative reason. For example, allow the people to make an agreement first, and then to shape their behavior that they are going according to, they are complying with the second condition. So again, the source for normative is not an expectation, but it is a reason to act, create in some way. But there is a lot to be discussed. I think that I have understood better also your point about this classification, and there was a lot of very interesting things, and also it's important your attitude to develop studies that can be useful for social change and for nudging in this perspective, which is completely new, because I agree completely with you that nudging has been used mainly for individual behavior, not for interaction and for the fact of social norms or principles based on expectations. So this is a new field, very important. I agree completely, and this can be important also for the economic analysis of the law, because of course social norms and common law are not so far. So probably this open a new approach to behavioral law in economics in some sense. So thank you very much, and see you again. Maybe in Italy, when you come in Italy.
I don't. Well, I plan to come if I can.
Of course.
In mid-end January and stay for a month, but it's very hard at the moment to fly to Italy. Philadelphia airport is closed internationally. I have to take like 3 flights, and the more flights, the more risk. And so it's, and there are now COVID flights. You have to do the testing 48 hours before, and then you can take the flight. Is a mess.
Oh, when you come, please inform us that you will organize.
Absolutely, we have to see
seminar in person in Milan.
Well, maybe you're still in the red.
Well,
likely. Okay, so thank you very much for all the questions. They are extremely stimulating, extremely good, especially the moral norm, social norm issue. Is give me a lot of food for thought. And thank you again, and I hope to see at least some of you in the future.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
All of you tomorrow in the continuation, the second day of the conference. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.